that firing Horner in this season, or frankly ever, with Red Bull is idiocy. This is like gold in your hand versus a steaming pile of shit in your hand. All right, let's see what the next question we have is straight from the dyno's mouth. Trevor says, thoughts on Horner being fired after Imola? Yeah, this is going around at the moment. I don't think there's any truth to it. Can I just say, first of all, I don't think Red Bull is going to drop Christian Horner like mid-season before the 2026 season, while they're also trying to keep Max, because that would just throw everything into chaos. But let's talk about it. So if they did, first of all, can I just point out that firing Horner in this season, or frankly ever, with Red Bull is idiocy. It would be the dumbest thing that Red Bull has done in the history of its racing team, would be to fire Horner, because Horner is the only reason why that team has been able to stick together over the last while. And in fact, if you look at what happened last year with the WhatsApp Fingergate, and all of the kind of mess behind the scenes and how that started to unfold things just with that going on, because you had Jos and Helmut and the board in Australia fighting against the Red Bull board in Thailand. Horner had the entirety of Milton Keynes behind him, and that's what caused such chaos. That's what shook things up so much. So to do this would just be terrible. And look, to be honest, first things first, let's just point out that the reason for Red Bull's success isn't Max Verstappen. It is the fact that Dietrich Mateschitz gave Horner basically free reign. Horner brought in Newey, for example, and some people will be like, no, that was actually David Coulthard. Yeah, because David Coulthard said, hey, I'm your second driver. Come over and look at this team. And that's why he joined. No, maybe David Coulthard set up the introduction, but it was Horner who sold him on it. It was Horner's vision of bringing everything together. And Helmut Marko, I still say to this day, Helmut Marko's best decision in Red Bull was to bring Horner forward. Because at the end of the day, Helmut Marko may have seen Verstappen. Helmut Marko may have seen Vettel, okay? But those drivers are not coming to Red Bull, and they're certainly not staying at Red Bull unless it's a successful team. And that is controlled from the top. Horner has been absolutely pulling the strings and setting the direction at Milton Keynes. If you talk to anyone at Milton Keynes, at the Red Bull base, they absolutely love Horner. So firing him would be a terrible idea. Helmut Marko, I've said, needs to go, to be honest, because he hasn't made a good decision in 9 years now, and all he does is cause trouble at the team. But look, that being said, okay, even if you think, let's say you're in the camp of thinking that Horner needs to go because of his actions last year, or because the team has fallen apart over the last year. Let me just dispel that real quick. It actually hasn't. If you look at the team, they're still beating Mercedes. They're still beating McLaren, at least with Max. Their problem right now is they've built a tricky car to drive because they've kind of pushed it around Max over years. And that was going on long before Newey left and long before things happened last year. It actually made sense for them for a long time. So I see why they did it. It's just a case of they probably need to change that now in these regs, but that's going on another tangent. But the point is, the difference between last year and this year is that McLaren have done a better job, not that Red Bull has fallen apart. And if you disagree with that, I'd love to know why. Let me know in the comments, because everything points to the fact that Red Bull hasn't actually, downgraded, fallen apart, gone to shit. It's just that McLaren has caught up. Because if you look at where Red Bull is now compared to where it was last year, it's in more or less the same position. The only difference is where McLaren is in reality. So yeah, which has pushed them into a narrower and narrower window, and there's too little time to fix it. I've talked about all this before. Let's move on. The quick point here is, if Horner leaves, the reason it'll be so dumb is because that will cause the team to set back for way longer than it's going to now. Look, Red Bull is going through a difficult time. Okay, it's going through a similar period to what kind of Mercedes was going through after 2021, and it's likely going to continue into 26, 27, maybe even 28, right? They're building a whole new engine that's going to take time and effort to build. They've got, a problem now where even if Max does stick around, He's not going to stick around after 2028, more than likely anyway, even if things do go well. So they have to kind of look for new drivers in a time where Helmut Marko, like I said, isn't very good at that anymore. So they're going to have to come up with kind of a revamp of their entire kind of junior program. And things are just going to get more difficult from here. And part of that as well is just that, unlike the last 3 years, the other teams are getting their shit together with the exception of Ferrari. Mercedes does seem to kind of understand the regs now. That might be an issue next year, but it won't be for long, it seems. It seems like they've rebuilt. McLaren have built one hell of a team now and got everything online. So they're going to be competitive even in 2026. This isn't a once-off. This is because they've built a team. And then you've got Aston Martin, which has unlimited funds and is run by Newey and Andy Kell. Like, just those two alone tell you everything you need to know. Andy Kell built the 2014 engine for Mercedes, and we know who Adrian Newey is. So everything's going to get more and more difficult from here. And what will happen is, if you remove Horner, you're going to have a couple of things happen that are going to cause that team to fall into chaos for 10 years. If Horner goes, the team falls apart anyway, because Milton Keynes, a lot of those guys will go wherever Horner goes, which means that that's going to destabilize the factory. It's going to demotivate the factory. And there is no one right now inside Red Bull who can take up that mantle. They can move in a Paul Monaghan. They can move in, a lot of other people in there that they have. They will move someone up. And I'm sure there is someone close to that. But a lot of people are going to go with Horner, which is going to initially destabilize that. Some people have said they shouldn't have dropped Jonathan Wheatley. They didn't. Jonathan Wheatley couldn't move up because Horner was there. And to be honest, as much as I rate Jonathan Wheatley, even if he took over from Horner tomorrow, he's not going to be able to do the same job. And again, people will go with Horner. I think people forget that. Horner is very, very good at running a team. He knows F1 in and out, and he has done this for 2 decades now at the top. Okay, so if Horner leaves that team, he is going to go somewhere else. I joked on our podcast yesterday, it's probably Alpine. But there are, there's Audi, there's Alpine, there's Cadillac. Even, look, at the end of the day, even Ferrari, Aston Martin, maybe not so much because of the Newey, problems. But yeah, there's a ton of other teams. Like Williams obviously won't with James Vowles. I'm trying to think who else there is. McLaren probably would consider it, as much as Zach Brown hates Christian Horner. The problem is Horner, I don't think, would go there after, all the Zach Brown incidents and so on. But yeah, he could go to Ferrari, Alpine, any of these teams that could then get deep pockets. Maybe he buys out an Alpine because he could probably get the backing, given his record, from someone in Saudi, whatever. The point is, he will not just be gone from F1. And any idea or any thinking that that's going to happen is ridiculous. So you're going to get tons of people following him. And that's just a fact, right? So you're going to have a lot of these top staff destabilize Milton Keynes. That's going to cause Max to just go anyway, because they're going to be destabilized at the time when they have to bring in a new engine, which means things are going to fall further apart. All of the blame from the technical stuff then can no longer land on Horner's head, which means it'll land on Bachet's head. They have a bad time in 2026. Their technical top guys go, I'm done with this. I'm out of here. They're gone. And the worst part of all this is, no matter who they replace him with, right? Let's say, for example, they do get Jonathan Wheatley and everyone thinks, oh, this is brilliant. Jonathan Wheatley will run a great team. They put Hannah Schmidt in charge, who's a fantastic strategist, for example. Whoever they put in, the they is the key there. It's going to be someone who is appointed by the board, the guys in Austria, in reality, because the Thai guys backed Dietrich, they backed Horner, but they seem to be less and less wanting to be involved. And that's why they kind of wanted Horner to run it, because it means that the company itself doesn't have to be hands-on. As soon as Horner goes, it's a board-appointed person. And I cannot tell you this enough. There are 2 things that are true in Formula 1 that apply to this situation. The first is that boards cannot run a Formula 1 team. Since John Todd left, a board has essentially been running the Ferrari team. It's gone well, hasn't it? It's gone really, really well. The only reason Mercedes haven't fallen apart is because of the simple fact that Toto Wolff doesn't have a board around him making decisions. And the people that he does have in this kind of board of Mercedes don't override him. He can override them because he owns 33%. He's got the confidence. He can do whatever he wants. And that's understood. Even if you look at McLaren for a couple of years was run by a board and it went really well. That wasn't just down to the Honda engine. Zach was appointed by the board, but he had to be given full on control by that board. And even then, it took 8 years for him to get on top of things. And I think what you can see right now is Zach Brown is clearly not an idiot, as much as he might not be great at dieting. The board control doesn't work, and we just have so many instances of this. Like I've mentioned Ferrari, there's Toyota, Honda, they had unlimited funds basically back in the day, went nowhere. BMW, for example. Boards can't run F1 teams. And no matter who is appointed after this, they will not have the same freedom and control that Horner has earned over the years. And therefore, they will have to do things according to what the board wants, which is just going to cause chaos, and it's never going to come back under board control. The second thing is, even if they do get someone who is smart enough and powerful enough to pull away from the board and get free reign from the board once again, history shows it's going to take 8 to 10 years for them to come back at least. And that's if everything goes well. It may never happen. Williams, once Frank stepped down, once, BMW almost took over, there's a lot of history there. That hasn't come back. Full stop. McLaren, when Dennis left, took over a decade. And let's be honest, McLaren are very lucky here. Let's look at Ferrari. Not only is that board controlled, after John Todd left, no one else has been able to do the job. Because with McLaren's case, they found a team principal pretty much straight away, well, a CEO pretty much straight away who was able to tackle the job. And by straight away, I mean within 2 or 3 years. Renault hasn't been able to do it. So even if Red Bull get absolutely lucky that the person that they choose is the right person, it's still going to take a decade, and it's never going to happen if that person happens to be controlled by the board. History is a wash of this in Formula One, and history in Formula One repeats itself so often, it's almost a joke. Look, I don't know, anyone who thinks that Horner going is a good idea is, frankly, in my books, wrong. I'd love to see why you think I'm wrong in the comments, but you're wrong. It's just, I will argue this to the hill, because Horner is the reason for that team's success. Verstappen is an amazing driver, but he can only do that last 10 to 20%. And he does it every time. It's why I praise him so much on this show and on our podcast, because he is the best driver since Schumacher in terms of extracting the most from a car every fucking weekend. But this is F1. If Max was driving a Haas, he wouldn't be fighting for podiums. And if you don't believe that, look at Max driving 2016 to 2020. Max was a brilliant driver. He didn't win championships because it's all about the car. And at the end of the day, as soon as Horner goes, that car starts to fall apart more than it is now. And I'm sorry, but if you think that Red Bull is bad right now because of the car, they still have, and I know you'll argue with this, the second fastest car on average. And even if you don't think that's true, at worst, it is tied with third for the Mercedes, and at most weekends this year so far, it has been within 0.3 of the McLaren. It is not a washed car. It is not a gone car. And there's already talk of Verstappen leaving. So if Horner goes, Verstappen will be gone by the summer. I guarantee you that. And if he's not, he's going to be in a backmarker car by 2027 if he decides to stay with Red Bull. So, Trev, I think I've been adamant about that. Thoughts on Horner being fired? It will be the absolute dumbest thing Red Bull has done in the history of its F1 team. If you stuck around till this part in the video, it means you've probably enjoyed it, I would assume. And if you did, that means you'll probably also enjoy my F1 podcast, the blatantly biased racing podcast, where I'm joined by my co-host, the casual F1 fan, every week, as well as a range of other guests. And it's basically a weekly podcast where we just rant about everything that's going on. Sometimes an hour, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, especially if we get a good chatty guest. So be sure to subscribe to that if you haven't already, and hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you again for watching. Bye. Okay, let's see what's next, straight from the dyno's mouth. Got a couple left, I think. All right. Tim asks, why would Carlos Sainz Sr., be allowed to run for FIA president when his son is a driver? So first of all, there is no, just to answer the question directly, there is no reason, there is no real kind of conflict reason not to be able to run. This isn't like an open election where all of the FIA and our F1 teams and like FIA guys, just normal people, get to vote. This is like a weird kind of, there's one person per region that gets to vote. As Casual on the podcast described it yesterday, it's very much a like electoral college type thing where there are electors that you have to kind of sway. I think there's 10 of them in total that you need to sway. So anyone's allowed as long as you can get those guys on board to vote for you, basically. Now, what he's discussing here is obviously more of a nuanced question, and I'm going to take it as not actually regulatory allowed, because that's a very boring video. What we're really talking about here is whether he should run because of the conflict of interest. Look, I think there's been a lot of these conflicts over the years. You know, we've had obviously Stefano Domenicali at Formula One itself, who's a former Ferrari team principal. We've had John Todd, who likewise was a former Ferrari team principal, and you could say that that was a huge conflict when they signed off the 2019 secret $100 million fine for Ferrari having an illegal engine, allegedly. I say allegedly, we all know it's fucking true because Seb admitted it, because Seb's a legend, and then Ferrari started cutting him out. So there was that one. We had Mosley, who obviously would have given a lot of preferential treatment to any German teams because he allegedly liked Nazi-themed orgies. Obviously, the orgy part was confirmed by Mosley, but it was only allegedly Nazi-themed. You know, we've had conflicts over the years, and the most famous one I'm sure a lot of you are aware of is... I can't remember his name now. Berlusconi. I can't remember his actual name, but it was a 1981 president, right? Who was the one who actually famously had the out with Bernie Ecclestone that caused the Concord Agreement, that actually caused the FIA to have to lease the Formula One commercial agreements to F1. So FIA presidents, I can't remember his name, but they've been a mess for a long time now in terms of conflicts with the sport. And personally, I think it's something that's kind of never going to go away. And the reason I think that is because typically these people who are in charge are of a racing background, which kind of makes sense, even though I think 60% of the FIA is based on mobility, not actually racing. So I think you're going to always get these conflicts. And the question is, how much are we willing to accept certain conflicts, right? And I think in most cases, we're not happy about them. But this one is a particularly close one to the heart, isn't it? So let's just talk about whether I think he's a good choice for president, first of all, and then maybe I'll give my thoughts on the actual conflict, whether I think it kind of should completely rule him out of coming in. In terms of whether he'd be a good president, I actually think Carlos Sainz Sr. would be a good president, given his background, if we forget about Carlos Sainz Jr. for 2 minutes, because he's a two-time World Rally champion, so he knows that side. He obviously has brought his son up and followed him and helped him and guided him into Formula One. So he's been in the paddock of Formula One a lot. He knows what the teams are up to. He knows a lot of the team staff. And he clearly, as a rally champion and as the father of a Formula One driver, is willing to listen to the drivers far more as well than the current president is. And he seems to know kind of how to play politics inside and out as well. And he's done that throughout his career. He also, on top of that, has an illustrious career with companies like Volkswagen and other companies he's raced for, and, you know, dealing with Red Bull and these big businesses as well. And I just think he'd be a good guy if the conflict wasn't there. I think we would all be saying, yeah, it's a much better guy to go, because we know he'll listen to the drivers. We know he'll use common sense. And even straight away, you know, coming back to the conflict for a second, he did automatically say, no, I'll put someone else in charge of F1. Now, there's a reason why that's not quite going to calm things, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Thing for me is, compared to the current president, this is like gold in your hand versus a steaming pile of shit in your hand, frankly. Because Mohammed bin Sulayem, is the worst FIA president in my lifetime. And I can't stress that enough, that Max Mosley and Bernie Ecclestone allegedly covered up the Singapore crash. The two of them, you know, worked hand in toe, whatever the fucking phrase is, together for years. And he was literally caught in an orgy that was allegedly Nazi themed. Max Mosley was. And yet I would still say Mosley was 100 million times better than the moron that is in charge at the minute, because he wants to be a dictator. He wants to clamp down, and he wants the drivers to shut up, which is the stupidest thing in the world. Formula One is all about the technical regulations for me. I personally watch Formula One for the cars, okay? That's why a lot of the time, a lot of people hate what I say about the drivers, because frankly, don't care half as much about the drivers as I do about the machinery and about the innovation, the engineering, all that sort of stuff. And then I admire the drivers for what they can do with those machines. And I like the characters and so on. For me, it's like I want an FIA president who will not only keep an eye on those technical things and make sure we have an exciting technical regulation and maybe not ruin an entire fucking 2026 reg set because they want Volkswagen in, although that one is more on Dominicali and the teams than anyone else. But I then want I want a guy who understands racing and will listen to the drivers when it comes to, okay, what is going to allow you to overtake more, defend better? You know, what's going to allow you to kind of run your legs a bit more, you know? And Sulayem doesn't seem to want to do that at all. What's going to allow the drivers to express more of their personality? You know, like some of the best moments in history of Formula One press conferences wouldn't have happened, frankly, if MBS at the moment was in charge. You know, some great moments of Seb taking the piss, Lewis taking the piss, Schumacher, Rosberg, not so much, but, you know, all of these people taking the piss and having a laugh and shouting and complaining about the FIA. They may have still happened, but they would have gotten penalized for it. So I want him gone. So that long rant is just to say, if it's a choice between these two, even if Carlos Sainz was in a title fight right now, I would still pick Carlos Sainz Sr. So I guess that answers one of your questions. Now, to talk about the conflict itself, I don't think there's anything he can do where that's not going to be a conflict or where it's going to appease everyone, to put it frankly, because he can put someone else in charge of Formula One operations, and that's fine. But you're still going to have a situation where if Williams or Carlos Sainz Jr. gets preferential treatment, even if you're like, well, like I'm recused from this, because confidence in the FIA is at an all-time low. I mean, we would have more confidence in America not to bomb Yemen than we would for the FIA not to get involved in something it shouldn't. But everyone will look at this and go, oh, well, sure, there's another person in charge, but obviously he's not going to go against his boss. That's going to be the simple thing, right? Even if it's unfounded, even if there's no evidence, even if it's frankly just not true, no one will believe that. So that's going to happen constantly. If Williams get in, like if last year, for example, when the McLaren flexi wing was allowed, if that was Williams in that position and Carlos Sainz Sr. was the president, we all know we would immediately be like, oh, well, the FIA must have been in charge here. I wouldn't. Personally, I think the FIA is incompetent, but, you know, I can see why that would happen. So that conflict's always going to be there. The only saving grace, I think, for the next while is that as long as Williams isn't fighting for wins and championships, no one's going to care. Because historically, no one gives a shit when a team at the back does something, and everyone gives a massive shit about it when it's someone at the front. But yeah, the conflict is a hard one to overcome. To answer the question just frankly, because I could go on forever about this, I guess, if it's a choice between MBS and Carlos Sainz Sr., even with the conflict, even if there was a title fight on, even if that title fight was Carlos Sainz Jr., I'd still take Carlos Sainz Sr. over MBS. However, if there is anyone else who could take this over, do it. Like, if there's anyone else that doesn't have a conflict, that is willing to go for this, that has some understanding of Formula One and rally and WEC and whatever, go for it. But until then, I would much rather this than MBS. It's just a quick interruption to say that the dinosaur has been quite sad lately because over 60% of you watching are not subscribed. And that is a clear signal that you don't like him. I mean, he's already dead. Give him a break. It's just a subscribe button. It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to bite you. That fucking thing might, though. Subscribe. Now back to the video. Okay, let's see what we got next, straight from Diagnosed Meth. Oh, last one for the week. Cool. All right. Albert Howard, one of our subscribers here. Hello, Albert. Says, will the new cars actually be able to race close and overtake, or will we get the same boring kind of similar DRS trains? Okay, so this is about the 2026 cars, I would imagine, because obviously the new cars. We know the ones at the moment have a serious dirty air problem. But let's just start off by saying I think that the 2026 regulations could end up being the worst regulation set in the history of Formula One. And this is coming from someone who was frankly optimistic about these regulations not so long ago. And the closer and closer we're getting, and the more I'm hearing, And the more and more I look at the details, talk to like people who actually know about this engineering in detail, the more concerned I am. So in terms of dirty air, what I was kind of happy about at the start was when you add some sort of active aero, there are ways that you could use active aero to get around some of the dirty air issues. The problem is that the ways of doing that are very complex, and the bigger problem is that the FIA hasn't even thought about that. So yes, to answer the question frankly, we're not going to get closer racing next year, I don't think, by looking at these. We're going to get more dirty air next year, I think, by looking at these. And I think we're going to get something even worse than DRS trains next year, which is I think it's going to be very, very hard to pass. The only reason we may get more overtakes next year is because this is a regulation set where it looks like at the moment the field spread is going to be massive. To put this in perspective, right, even at the moment when McLaren is dominating, in qualifying, we are getting the first like 3 to 5 cars finishing within 0.2. The top 3 finished in Miami within 1/10 of one another. We're looking here, from what I'm hearing, at potentially having at least 1 or 2 of the teams being 3 seconds ahead of the next teams behind them. To put that in perspective, like Mercedes had a 1 second advantage in 2014, 15, 16. Red Bull had a 0.2 advantage in qualifying in 2023. They had a 0.7 advantage in the race. McLaren have had less this year, but if we took Miami as a case study, because Miami was an outlier, and I've done a video on that, so whatever. That was, nearly a second. Now imagine if Mercedes show up and like McLaren, who have the same engine, shit the bed on the aero, or McLaren get everything right and Mercedes shit the bed. We could have a 3-second difference between those two. If McLaren, Mercedes, and Alpine all get it wrong, and Williams get the aero perfect, and Honda get the aero perfect, we could have a 2 to 3 second difference between the engines, apparently, which is insane because these engines are so highly regulated that my initial thought was, oh, these should be within 10 horsepower of each other realistically because there's so little to work on. And apparently everyone has shit the bed so badly on engines that is not going to be the case. The field spread, from what I'm hearing, from everything I'm hearing, could be as much as 6 seconds from 1st to 20th on a given weekend. So we may get more overtaking, but it won't be fun overtaking. It'll be like Mercedes when Hamilton has a bad qualifying weekend, starts in 20th and just guns through the field like it's nothing. It'll be like Spa in 2023, where as impressive as it was to watch Lewis come through the field in Brazil in 21, for example, when the car is 0.7 faster, you're just overtaking on the straight, overtaking on the straight, overtaking on the straight, overtaking on the straight. It's not fun racing. So we may get more overtakes for that reason. Now, in terms of just dirty air has become a huge problem this year. Once again, we've seen how overtaking happens. That is a problem because obviously the more complex these car gets, the more turbulent the air is behind because you've got more vortexes. The air basically is hitting the car, getting funneled to all the right places, getting vortexes off, and it's just coming out a wash of turbulence because the engineers frankly don't care about the air behind their car. They just care about the downforce on their car. So the dirty air is going to be even worse in 2026 potentially. And if it's not in 2026, it's going to be even worse by year 2 or 3 of these regulations. Let me explain why. Because the way that the active aero is set up at the moment is to allow the cars to be faster with engines that were in trouble. So this may not be as applicable now because the engines, they're kind of changing the balance of power in the engines between electric and so on. But the active aero isn't changing. It's too late to change that. And that active aero is all about efficiency for the car. It's nothing to do with controlling dirty air, with overtaking. It's just to do with aero efficiency of that car so that it has downforce in the corners and then has less drag in the straights so that that underpowered engine is allowed to, get it down the straight without the car looking too slow. The problem with that is when you're working on efficiency with active aero, you're just causing dirty air behind the car more so. On top of that, they haven't cleaned up any lines and they've reduced the ground effect by 30%, which means they have to demonstrate more downforce on top of the car, which again, because the underfloor was brought out to get rid of dirty air because you can't have vortexes and different things under the car. That means there's going to be more dirty air coming out the back of the car, which means there's going to be more dirty air overall. The only saving grace is that in the first year of the regulations, obviously the cars will be in their kind of most basic state. So there won't be as much dirty air, but it will rapidly climb, I would imagine. So yeah, dirty air is going to be a huge problem with these next cars, mainly because of the active aero. And it's such a shame because these current set of cars, like in 2022, the dirty air idea had somewhat worked. Now, part of that was to the fact that the cars were all in their simple guises. But even 23 and and up until kind of this year, basically, and like last year it was bad, this year it's worse. 2022, 2023, the cars could follow. Just Red Bull had a massive advantage, apart from like Aston was close-ish at the start, not really. Um, but all they had to do for 2026 was, even with the new engines, or no, I guess they would have had to scrap the new engines. But yeah, all they had to do for 2026 is say, right, we're going to keep the same concept of cars, but we're going to clamp down on all of these kind of dirty air causing aero pieces on the car and really just focus on everything we've learned and made cars that can actually overtake and follow and pass. But they didn't do that. I think the only solution to this going forward, because we keep finding ourselves in this situation and they've tried changing the regulations repeatedly now and nothing is fixing the dirty air. I think the only solution to this, and I hope they think about this for 2029 regulations onwards, I think the only regulation is to basically have every car fitted with sensors behind the rear wings, just some sensors kind of at the rear wings and above the rear wings, which they can easily do, that track the airflow. And we have some sort of metric that basically says, right, you can't have over this amount of dirty air. Obviously, that's a simplification, but you could have the turbulence or the vortices or whatever can't be above this percentage. And that way it's up to the designers of the car to fix that, like that. These guys are the smartest engineers in the world. So if you tell them, look, you got to design a fast car that doesn't cause more than 15% downforce loss for the car behind, they'll figure it out. And I think that is the only option now going forward. These are the regulations. You can work with these, and this is your maximum turbulence behind. Those are your options. I think that's the only option. But yeah, to answer your question, Albert, I do think it's going to be worse racing. I think it's going to be more dirty air. Like I said, maybe not straight away, because it takes dirty air is a lot to do with the efficiency of the car in front. So as the cars get more and more efficient, obviously the dirty air gets worse. We're seeing that right now. Yeah. Now, as most of you are aware, there is a technical directive coming in Barcelona, which means that all of the teams under the current load tests for their front wing have to have a flex tolerance of less than 10 millimeters. Basically, what that means is if I was, for example, to stand on the wing, obviously it's going to be an actual load, which is hopefully heavier than me, but I am on a diet. At that particular load, the wing can't flex more than 10 millimeters in any direction. Now, at the moment, that is 15 millimeters. This is changing to clamp down in Barcelona, but most of you already know that. What the news is that McLaren have, in fact, according to not only McLaren themselves, but some other people that I've spoken to around the paddock, have been running a 10 millimeter compliant front wing for the past while now. Now, I would expect that they would still bring a new front wing to Barcelona along with a lot of the other teams. But this means a few things. First of all, the reason I would expect them to still bring a new front wing to Barcelona is that if they have in fact been running the 10 millimeter front wing for a while now, which I actually expected kind of after the first couple of races that they were already doing that, the idea of bringing a new wing would essentially be to take all of the learnings from the last few Grand Prix of running that wing with a more stiff profile and putting that into a new wing that you will bring from the new technical directive on. So it would make sense that every team, except we know Sauber, will bring a new wing. Sauber aren't bringing a new wing because they said that theirs is basically already shit and isn't flexing. So basically they never took advantage of the flexibility and therefore don't need to change the front wing at all. So McLaren, it seems, have been running a 10 millimeter compliant wing for at least the last 3 races. and potentially since the start of the season. I haven't got a full answer on that. Now, the reason I expected that this was happening is that the McLaren was a very, very compliant car in terms of handling characteristics over the course of last season, especially after Miami. And this was a deep focus that McLaren were working on. And at the start of the season, we could see that the car was trickier to drive. Lando has complained about this a lot. And while Oscar seems to be much, much more comfortable with it, he has even talked about the fact that it is quite tricky to drive. In fact, going into the braking zones, they're saying that it doesn't give the drivers much confidence. And earlier in the season, myself and Casual on my F1 podcast, the Blatantly Biased Racing podcast, discussed why this would be. And there were two real theories. The general one that both of us said was probably the case was, as we've seen with Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes, as you push towards the peak of these regulations, they become more and more stiff and hard to drive anyway. So that was the most likely reason. However, I did posit something at the time which I thought could be the case, in that perhaps McLaren, given that the news of these new regulations, of this new technical directive came in January, had rushed through a wing that was compliant in order to make sure that they were able to basically get on top of this, learn as much as they could, and kind of redefine the rest of the car and the setups for that technical directive, so there wasn't a steep drop off from round 9 onwards. And to me, that was something that I posited because I thought, you know what, one thing that the flexi wings allow the car to do is to kind of deal with those tricky characteristics that the Red Bull had, because it allows you to have less load on the straights and more load on the kind of low speed corners, and to just deal with some of the understeer, oversteer imbalances of these cars, these ground effect cars that are just stiffer and harder to drive. So it seemed to me like that would be an indicator that perhaps they are already kind of dealing with this, and slowly over time they're kind of figuring out how to set the car up. So that was one thing I posited. And then about a week ago, we heard from McLaren, from a few people at McLaren. I had heard this from people I talked to in there, that they had been running a kind of stiffer front wing that had a 10 millimeter tolerance for at least the last 3 races. I couldn't find out exactly when they started, whether it was the start of the season, but I did find that out. And then on top of that, Sky Sports as well had been told vehemently by McLaren that they were running it. And then I heard from someone else who's close to the FIA that apparently, in terms of their tests, they're pretty sure it would pass those load tests anyway. So that would indicate, from everything I'm hearing, from what Sky Sports are hearing, for example, that they are in fact running that wing. Now, why that's a problem for the other teams is that the front wing that they ran in Miami is therefore compliant with Spain, which means any hopes that Red Bull would have that there would be some massive drop-off from the second per lap lead, albeit that was an outlier, they're not usually that far ahead of the team, as I discussed in another video, won't be offset by a front wing drop-off. So it does seem like they are running that front spec wing. And let me just touch on a couple of things, because I am sure, 100% sure, knowing YouTube comments and Twitter comments, how things go down, that there will be lots and lots of comments in 2 weeks' time saying something along the lines of, "This video aged like milk, you fat bald bastard." And I understand those, because 2 things will happen. The first is that McLaren are very likely, like the other 9 teams that I mentioned, other than Sauber, going to bring a new front wing anyway. So that will cause a lot of people to say, well, why did they bring a new front wing then, you absolute moron? Well, the reason behind that is obvious. They brought a compliant front wing when they didn't need to learn as much as they could from that front wing under the new regulations, when they were allowed some amount of tolerance and when they could switch it out to gain points and so on, so that they could take all of that learning and then over the past little while, which is why I think it's since the start of the season and not like 3 races, over the past while, build a brand new front wing that would account for any issues they had found during that learning, which would allow them to continue their advantage on over the rest. And something I've been saying for a long time anyway is that if McLaren are already the best at understanding a flexible front wing at 15 millimeters, they're probably going to be the best at understanding a flexible front wing at 10 millimeters. A lot of this is probably down to the fact that they have the gray area specialist from Red Bull with them for the past while in Rob Marshall, who I think is basically the next Newey. Is that an exaggeration? Definitely. Am I going to stick by it? Probably. Mainly because it'll annoy a lot of you in the comments. The second reason people are going to say this is going to age like milk is because this is something that always happens in Formula One. What I mean is, every time we think someone is cheating, that there's a new technical directive or something like that, there coincidentally always happens to be a bad weekend. So what will happen here is that there will be a weekend in Spain where McLaren, both of their drivers, fuck up in qualifying or screw it up in the race, throw it into a barrier or into the gravel, and all of you will come steaming into the comments to tell me that this video aged like milk, you're an idiot, and you have about as much wheel knowledge as you do head hair, and that I was absolutely wrong, only for us to go to Canada and find out that that was, as usual in this sport, purely coincidental, and they will be absolutely back on point again, dominating. This always happens. So I just beg of you, if you're going to call me out for aging like milk with this video, at least wait until fucking Canada. But yeah, this is a big deal. So it seems like like I said, from what I've heard and from what Sky Sports have said, that this is true, that they have been running this wing. I would imagine over the next couple of weeks in the lead up to Barcelona that we will get some sort of confirmation from this. And the other thing to take with a grain of salt, I suppose, that I need to think about is we do need to keep in mind that McLaren themselves insisting that they're running this could just be a tactic to shut Red Bull up. So there is always that chance that that's where it's come from and it is filtered down to other people. But the FIA kind of testing closeness that I've heard, that is what makes me kind of think there is some truth to this, and that McLaren don't really have a reason to lie other than, you know, because I don't know, it would be a weird thing for them to do because Andrea Stella always kind of downplays things. So it would be odd for him not to come out and say, no, we're running, current wings and we will be hit just as hard as everyone else. It's an interesting one. But yeah, it does not look like McLaren dominance will be swayed by this regulation. So that's bad news for Red Bull fans. Well, I say Red Bull fans, Max fans, let's be honest, just like how Hamilton fans weren't Mercedes fans, obviously, and so on. But it doesn't matter. So it looks like if that doesn't change things and Red Bull don't figure stuff out, Max may be back to number 33 on the car next year, with Piastri running number 1 because Lando will bottle it. We'll be back to regularly scheduled Dinosaur's Mouth questioning tomorrow, and I may make some sort of breaking news intro. Probably won't, though. Seems like effort. Thank you. Subscribe.